James Whitmore stood at the window of his penthouse office, looking down at the city streets 50 floors below. The cars and people looked like toys from up here, which was exactly how he liked it. At 55 years old, he had built an empire, worth billions, and he didn't get there by caring about the little people. His assistant knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Whitmore, the Wilson deal needs your signature right away." James turned around, his expensive Italian shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. "Bring me the briefcase with the cash. I want to close this today." Minutes later, he was walking briskly through the busy streets of New York, clutching his leather briefcase containing $100,000. The winter wind bit at his face, but he barely noticed it. His mind was already on his next deal, his next victory. That's when it happened. A group of teenagers on skateboards rushed past him, knocking him off balance. He stumbled, his grip on the briefcase loosening for just a second. But a second was all it took. The briefcase slipped from his hands, and in the chaos of the crowded sidewalk, he lost sight of it. James spent the next 2 hours in a rage. He called security, threatened to fire his assistant, and even considered calling the police. But he knew that would only bring unwanted attention to the cash he was carrying. "Sir," his receptionist's voice came through the intercom, There's someone here to see you." "Not now," he barked. "Sir, they say they found your briefcase." James froze. Then he stormed to the reception area, ready to face whoever was trying to extort him. But what he saw stopped him in his tracks. A little girl stood there, drowning in a coat that was far too big for her. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her face was thin, too thin, and a worn-out beanie covered what he realized with a shock was a completely bald head. In her small hands, she held his briefcase. "I think this belongs to you," she said in a quiet voice. "I saw when you dropped it." James grabbed the briefcase and opened it right there. Every dollar was still inside, neatly stacked just as he had left it. He looked back at the girl, his mind struggling to understand. "You didn't take anything?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief. The girl shook her head. "That would be stealing. And anyway, I know what it's like to lose something important." Something about those words, spoken with such simple honesty, made James's throat tight. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she said, managing a small smile despite how tired she looked. "Sophie Martinez." "Well, Sophie Martinez, you did the right thing. I should give you a reward." He reached for his wallet, but Sophie's next words stopped. "Him cold. Could I have dinner with you instead?" James stared at her, not sure he had heard correctly. "Dinner?" Sophie nodded, twisting her hands together nervously. "Just once. It's just, I see you sometimes going into this building. You always look so important. And I thought maybe you could tell me what that's like, to be important." For the first time in decades, James Whitmore felt tears burning in his eyes. This child, who clearly had nothing, who could have taken enough money to change her life, was asking for nothing more than his time. "Where do you live, Sophie?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. Sophie's eyes dropped to the floor. "The shelter on 23rd Street, but only sometimes, when there's room." James looked at his expensive watch, then at the briefcase, full of money, and finally at this small, brave girl who had shown him more integrity than any business partner he'd ever had. "How about we get that dinner right now?" he heard himself say. The smile that lit up Sophie's face was like sunshine, breaking through clouds. And as James watched her eyes fill with joy, he felt something inside him shift. Something he thought he had buried long ago under years of ruthless business deals and cold ambition. He felt his heart begin to thaw. As they walked out of the building together, Sophie's small hand trustingly in his, James didn't know that this moment would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. He didn't know that this little girl would teach him more about wealth than all his billions ever had. All he knew was that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't thinking about money or power or his next deal. He was thinking about what kind of pizza a little girl might like for dinner. The Italian restaurant was one of the fanciest in New York, but James couldn't take his eyes off the little girl sitting across from him. Sophie looked even smaller in the large leather booth, her worn coat now hanging on a hook beside James's expensive suit jacket. Under the warm lighting, He could see how pale she was, how dark the circles were under her eyes. "Order anything you want," James said, handing her the menu. He noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she held it. "I've never been to a restaurant like this before," Sophie admitted, her eyes wide as she looked around at the crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths. "Could I maybe have spaghetti?" James nodded, and when the waiter came, he ordered a plate of spaghetti and meatballs for Sophie and just a coffee for himself. He wasn't hungry anymore. Something about this child's situation was making his stomach twist. "Sophie," he said carefully, "where are your parents?" Sophie's small fingers played with the edge of the tablecloth. "My mom died 2 years ago. She got sick like me. Dad left after that. He said he couldn't handle it anymore." James felt his hands clench into fists under the table. "And you're sick now?" She nodded, touching her beanie self-consciously. "The doctors call it leukemia. I was getting treatment at the children's hospital, but then the insurance stopped. That's why we lost our apartment. Dad couldn't pay for everything." The waiter brought Sophie's spaghetti, and James watched as she carefully unfolded her napkin and placed it in her lap, trying so hard to be proper. Something broke inside him at the sight. "When was the last time you saw a doctor?" he asked. 3 months ago, Sophie said between small, careful bites of pasta. "The shelter tries to help, but there's not much they can do. But it's okay, I'm not scared." But James was scared. For the first time in years, he was terrified. This little girl who had returned his money without a second thought, who spoke about her illness with such quiet bravery, was dying. And the only reason was money, the very thing he had more of than he could ever spend. "Tell me about your mom," he said softly. Sophie's face lit up with a smile, even as tears filled her eyes. "She was the best mom ever. She used to read to me every night, even when she was really sick, and she made the best chocolate chip cookies. She said that kindness was like those cookies. It might seem small, but it could make anyone's day better." James thought about the briefcase in his office, about how this child could have taken that money and gotten the treatment she needed. But she hadn't. She had chosen kindness over survival. "Do you miss her?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Every day," Sophie said simply. "But she told me before she died that she'd always be watching over me. Sometimes, when good things happen, like meeting you today, I think maybe she helped make it happen." The waiter came by to check on them, and James ordered a slice of chocolate cake for Sophie. As she ate it, her eyes bright with delight, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Sophie," he said, "what if I told you you could see a doctor tomorrow, the best doctor in the city?" She looked up at him, chocolate frosting on her chin. "Really? Really? And what if I told you you didn't have to stay at the shelter anymore, that you could have a warm bed and all the spaghetti you could eat?" Sophie's fork clattered to the plate. But why would you do that?" James reached across the table and took her small hand in his. "Because today you taught me something that all my money never could. You taught me about integrity, about kindness. And now I want to teach you something." "What?" she whispered. "That sometimes fairy tales come true. That sometimes when you choose to be good, even when life isn't good to you, miracles can happen." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Like my mum's cookies?" James smiled, feeling his own eyes grow wet. "Exactly like your mum's cookies." As they left the restaurant, Sophie's hand trustingly in his again, James pulled out his phone. He had calls to make, to his lawyer, to the best oncologists in the country, to the social services department. By morning he would move heaven and earth to save this little girl, but for now he just listened as Sophie chatted about her favorite books and how she missed going to school. He looked down at her happy face and realized that when she had returned his briefcase, she had given him something far more valuable than money. She had given him back his humanity. And as they walked through the snowy New York streets, James Whitmore, the man who had everything, finally understood what true wealth meant. It wasn't in his bank accounts or his penthouse or his company's stock price. It was holding hands with a little girl who had nothing to give but kindness, and knowing that somehow, impossibly, she had given him everything. The next morning, James's office was buzzing with activity. His secretary, Linda, had never seen him like this. Instead of barking orders about business deals, he was on the phone with doctors, lawyers, and social workers. His usual perfectly pressed suit was wrinkled, and dark circles under his eyes showed he hadn't slept. "I don't care what it costs," he snapped into the phone. "I want the best oncologist in the country. No, not next week. Today." Linda watched in amazement as her usually cold boss slammed down the phone and immediately picked it up again. This time his voice softened. "Sophie?" "Yes, it's James. How are you feeling this morning?" "Good. Listen, I'm sending a car to pick you up at the shelter. The doctor's going to see you today." After he hung up, Linda couldn't help asking, "Mr. Whitmore, is everything okay?" James looked at her, and for the first time in the 15 years she'd worked for him, she saw tears in his eyes. "No, Linda, nothing's okay, but I'm going to fix it." The problems started almost immediately. The social worker, Mrs. Thompson, arrived first. She was a stern woman who'd seen too many rich men try to throw money at problems they didn't understand. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, sitting rigidly in his office, "you can't just take a child from a shelter. There are procedures, regulations, and quite frankly, your sudden interest in this girl raises concerns." James felt his temper rising, but forced himself to stay calm. "I understand, but Sophie needs medical treatment now. Today. She has leukemia, for God's sake." "And where was this concern for children with leukemia last week?" Mrs. Thompson asked sharply. "Or last year? Do you know how many sick children are in our shelters?" The truth of her words hit James like a slap. He sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 55 years. "You're right," he said quietly. "I didn't care before. I walked past people needing help every day and didn't see them. But Sophie, she showed me something. She showed me who I used to be before I let money become everything." Mrs. Thompson's expression softened slightly. "Tell me about yesterday." So James told her everything, about the briefcase, about Sophie's request for dinner, about her mother and her quiet bravery. By the time he finished, even the tough social worker had tears in her eyes. "I've never asked for anything in my life," James said. "I've always just taken what I wanted, but now I'm asking, please help me help her." Before Mrs. Thompson could answer, there was a commotion in the outer office. A man burst in, his clothes disheveled, his eyes wild. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Where's my daughter?" James stood up. "You must be Sophie's father." "Yeah, and who the hell are you?" "The shelter called, said some rich guy was asking about her. Let me tell you something, she's my daughter, mine, and if there's money involved, I have rights." James felt sick. This was the man who had abandoned his dying daughter, and now he was back smelling money. "Where were you?" James asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Where were you when she was sleeping in shelters? When she needed medicine? When she cried for her mother?" Sophie's father took a step forward, his face red. "Listen, you smug bastard." "No, you listen." James cut him off. "I made my fortune by seeing opportunities. Right now I see two. One, I can help your daughter get the treatment she needs, give her a home, a future. Two, I can have my lawyers dig into every detail of how you abandoned a minor with a life-threatening illness. Which opportunity would you like me to pursue?" The man's face went pale. Mrs. Thompson stood up, pulling out her notebook. "Mr. Martinez," she said crisply, "I think we need to have a discussion about parental rights and neglect charges." Just then, Linda's voice came over the intercom. "Mr. Whitmore, Sophie's here." James's heart clenched. She couldn't see her father like this, couldn't deal with this stress in her condition. "Take her to the conference room, Linda. Tell her I'll be right there." He turned to Mrs. Thompson. "Please, handle this. I'll sign anything, pay anything, submit to any background check. Just help me keep her safe." Mrs. Thompson looked from James to Sophie's angry father and back again. Then she nodded slowly. "I'll expedite the emergency custody paperwork," she said, "in light of the medical situation and current circumstances." James didn't wait to hear more. He hurried to the conference room, straightening his tie, trying to put on a smile. Sophie was sitting in one of the big leather chairs, looking tiny and fragile but happy to see him. "James," she said, her face lighting up, "the car you sent had a TV in it." He sat down next to her, taking her small hand. "Did you like that? Just wait until you see the doctor's office. It has an aquarium with real tropical fish." "Really?" Her eyes went wide with wonder. "Really? And after that, I thought maybe we could look at some houses. Would you like that?" Sophie squeezed his hand. "Will you live there too?" James felt his heart swell. "If you want me to." "I do," she said simply. "You know why? Because you look less sad now. Mom always said everybody needs somebody to make them less sad." Outside the conference room, lawyers and social workers were gathering. Papers were being drawn up, arguments were brewing. A battle was coming. But in that moment, holding Sophie's trusting hand, James knew he would win. He had spent his life winning business wars. Now he would fight the most important battle of his life, the battle to save a little girl who had saved him first. "Your mom was very wise," he said softly. "And you know what? She was right. Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center was the best hospital in New York, maybe in the whole country." James sat in the waiting room, his leg bouncing nervously as Sophie underwent her first round of tests. The emergency custody order had come through just in time, thanks to Mrs. Thompson's quick work and James's army of lawyers. "Mr. Whitmore?" A nurse appeared at the door. "Sophie's asking for you." James jumped up, nearly knocking over his coffee. He followed the nurse down the brightly painted hallway to Sophie's room. The walls were decorated with cartoon characters, but they couldn't hide the serious medical equipment surrounding the small bed. Sophie lay there, looking even tinier in the hospital gown, but she smiled when she saw him. "James, the doctor said I was very brave during the tests." He sat down beside her bed, taking her hand carefully around the IV line. "Of course you were brave. You're the bravest person I know." Dr. Sarah Chen, the top pediatric oncologist in the country, came in holding a thick file of test results. Her face was serious and James felt his heart sink. "The cancer has progressed significantly in the months without treatment," Dr. Chen said quietly. "But there's hope. We can start an aggressive treatment plan immediately." Sophie squeezed James's hand. "Is it going to hurt?" Dr. Chen sat on the edge of the bed. "Sometimes it will, sweetheart. But we're going to do everything we can to help with that. And look what I have here." She pulled out a tablet. "This has movies, games, and books you can use during treatment. It's yours to keep." Sophie's eyes lit up, but then she looked uncertainly at James. He nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, it's okay." As Sophie explored her new tablet, Dr. Chen took James aside. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to be honest with you. The treatment will be intense and expensive. We're looking at months of chemotherapy, possibly a bone marrow transplant. Money is not an issue," James said firmly. "Whatever she needs, she gets. I want her to have the best chance possible." Dr. Chen smiled slightly. "You know, when they told me James Whitmore was bringing in a patient, I expected, well, something different. You're not what the papers make you out to be." James looked back at Sophie, who was showing her new tablet to a nurse. "I'm not who I used to be. She changed everything." That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, James sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair watching her. He'd cancelled 3 board meetings and a business trip to Tokyo. But for the first time in his life, work seemed meaningless compared to what was happening in this room. His phone buzzed. Another message from Sophie's father's lawyer, demanding a meeting. James deleted it without reading it. Nothing was going to interfere with Sophie's treatment. Nothing. The next few days fell into a routine. James would arrive at the hospital early each morning with breakfast. Plain toast and strawberry jam, the only thing Sophie could keep down during chemo. He had his assistant convert one of the hospital room's corners into a mini-office. But most of his work went untouched. Instead, he spent his days reading to Sophie, playing games on her tablet or just talking. She told him more about her mother, about the little things she remembered, the way her mom would dance while cooking, how she knew just how to fix any scraped knee or hurt feeling. "Do you think she would have liked you?" Sophie asked one afternoon during her treatment. James thought about it seriously. "I hope so. I think she would have liked how I am now, with you. But she probably wouldn't have liked the old me very much. What were you like before? Sophie asked, curious. James sighed. I was lonely. And when people are lonely for too long, sometimes they forget how to care about others. They focus on things instead of people. Like your briefcase? Sophie asked wisely. Exactly like my briefcase, but you know what? When you brought it back to me, you didn't just return my money. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. What's that? That the most valuable things in life can't be kept in a briefcase. Sophie smiled, then winced as the chemotherapy drugs coursed through her system. James quickly grabbed the basin as she got sick, holding her gently and wiping her face with a cool cloth afterward. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears in her eyes. Don't ever be sorry, he said fiercely. You're fighting so hard and I'm so proud of you. Later that night, after Sophie had finally fallen asleep, a nurse found James in the hallway, his face in his hands. First time as a parent? She asked kindly. James looked up, startled. I'm not really... Honey, the nurse said, patting his shoulder. I've been doing this job for 20 years. Blood doesn't make a parent. Love does. And the way you look at that little girl, that's pure father love if I ever saw it. James felt tears fill his eyes. I'm so scared, he admitted for the first time. What if I can't save her? The nurse sat down beside him. You're already saving her. Every day you're here, every time you hold her hand, every story you read, you're giving her something to fight for. Sometimes that's the best medicine there is. Through the window, James could see Sophie sleeping peacefully, her favorite stuffed bear, a gift from Linda, tucked under her arm. The machines beeped steadily, monitoring her vital signs, pumping medicine into her tiny body. I used to think I was powerful, James said softly. I could make million-dollar deals with a phone call. I could change company fortunes with a signature. But sitting here watching her fight, I've never felt so helpless. The nurse smiled. Maybe that's the gift she's giving you. Sometimes we need to feel helpless to remember what really matters. James nodded, wiping his eyes. Through the window, he saw Sophie stir slightly in her sleep, and without thinking, he hurried back to her room. As he sat down in his usual chair, she reached out unconsciously for his hand. He took it gently, careful of the IV lines, and settled in for another night of watching over his little girl. Because that's what she was now, his. Not by blood, but by something stronger, by a love that had grown from a simple act of kindness into something that was changing them both. Outside the hospital, the city buzzed with its usual energy. Deals were being made. Money was changing hands, life was going on. But in room 412, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the steady beep of the monitors, the warmth of a small hand in his, and the fierce hope in James Whitmore's heart that love really could be the strongest medicine of all. The headlines in the New York Times business section screamed, Whitmore Empire in Crisis, CEO abandons company for mystery child. James tossed the newspaper in the trash without reading further. He had bigger concerns. Sophie's latest test results weren't good, and they needed to make some difficult decisions about her treatment. The board is demanding an emergency meeting, Linda told him as he walked into his makeshift hospital office. They're saying you've missed too many important decisions. The stock price is dropping. James loosened his tie. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, splitting his time between the hospital and trying to keep his business empire from crumbling. Schedule it for tomorrow morning, early before Sophie's treatment. There's something else, Linda said hesitantly. Sophie's father's lawyer called again. They're filing a lawsuit claiming you manipulated the emergency custody situation. They want a hearing. James slammed his hand on the desk. That man abandoned her, left her alone and sick in a shelter, and now that there's money and publicity involved, he suddenly wants to be father of the year. James? Sophie's small voice came from the doorway. She stood there in her pink pajamas, one hand gripping her IV pole. Are you mad? His anger melted instantly. No, sweetheart, just grown-up problems. You should be in bed. You have a big day tomorrow. Sophie shuffled over to him, dragging her IV pole. I couldn't sleep. Can you tell me a story? James scooped her up gently, mindful of her IV lines, and carried her back to her room. How about the one about the princess who saved the grumpy old king? That's my favorite. Sophie smiled weakly. Because the princess is like me and the king is like you. James tucked her into bed, his heart aching at how frail she looked. The aggressive chemotherapy was taking its toll. Her face was gaunt and dark circles shadowed her eyes. But her smile, that smile still lit up the whole room. Mr. Whitmore? Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway. We need to talk about the next phase of treatment. James kissed Sophie's forehead. Try to sleep, princess. I'll be right back. In the hallway, Dr. Chen's face was grave. The chemotherapy isn't working as well as we hoped. We need to consider a bone marrow transplant, but finding a match will be difficult without biological family members to test. Her father has refused to be tested, Dr. Chen finished. We've already asked. James felt the fury rising in him again. I'll be tested, and I'll pay for a worldwide search if I have to. Mr. Whitmore, Dr. Chen said gently, you should also know the press is getting more aggressive. We've had to increase security on the floor, and there are rumors that Child Services is getting pressure to review the custody arrangement. James ran a hand through his graying hair. I'm not leaving her. I don't care what it costs, money, my company, my reputation, none of it matters. James, Sophie called from her room, can you come back? I'm scared. He hurried back to find her sitting up in bed, tears rolling down her cheeks. What's wrong, sweetheart? I heard some nurses talking, she whispered. They said my dad is trying to take me away from you. I don't want to go with him. Please don't. Let him take me. James gathered her in his arms, his expensive suit getting wet with her tears. Listen to me, Sophie. No one is taking you anywhere. I promise you that. But what if they make you? What if... Hey, he tilted her chin up to look at him. Do you remember what I told you about being a businessman? She nodded. That you always win. That's right. And this is the most important fight of my life. I'm not going to lose you, Sophie. Not to cancer, not to your father, not to anyone. There was a commotion in the hallway. James looked up to see Mrs. Thompson from Social Services hurrying in, looking worried. Mr. Whitmore, we have a problem, a big one. James held Sophie tighter. Whatever it is, we'll handle it. Sophie's father has gone to the media. He's giving interviews, claiming you bribed officials for custody, that you're using his daughter. For publicity. It's getting ugly. Sophie began to tremble in James's arms. He stroked her back soothingly while his mind raced. Mrs. Thompson, he said quietly, I need you to look at Sophie right now. Really look at her. When I found her, she was dying in a shelter because that man couldn't be bothered to care for his own child. Now he wants to drag her through a media circus while she's fighting for her life? I won't. Allow it. The system has rules, Mr. Whitmore, even for billionaires. Then we'll change the rules. James's voice was steel. I'll hire every lawyer in New York if I have to. I'll call in every favor, use every resource I have, but I will not let anyone hurt this child again. Sophie had fallen asleep in his arms, exhausted from crying. James laid her gently back on her pillows, tucking her favorite bear beside her. You really love her, don't you? Mrs. Thompson asked softly. James touched Sophie's cheek gently. More than I ever thought possible. She saved my life, you know. I was dead inside, just going through the motions. She taught me how to feel again, how to care about something more than money and power. Mrs. Thompson watched them for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone. I'm calling in some favors of my own. We'll fight this together. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the hospital was quiet, James sat in his usual chair beside Sophie's bed. On his laptop, emails piled up about crashing stock prices and board revolts. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from lawyers and reporters, but James wasn't looking at any of that. He was watching Sophie sleep, counting her breaths, praying to a God he hadn't believed in for years that she would be strong enough for what was coming. I used to think I knew what fighting meant, he whispered to her sleeping form. I thought it was about hostile takeovers and business deals, but you're teaching me what real courage looks like, and I promise you, my brave girl, we're going to fight this battle together, and we're going to win. Outside the hospital window, storm clouds were gathering over New York City, but inside room 412, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would test the bounds of love, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a broken man and the little girl who had saved his soul. The morning news vans lined the street outside Memorial Sloan Kettering. Reporters clustered near the entrance, hoping to catch a glimpse of James Whitmore or Sophie's father, Robert Martinez. The custody battle had become the biggest story in New York, with people taking sides and debating it on every TV channel. Inside Sophie's hospital room, none of that mattered. James sat beside her bed, watching as she struggled through a round of chemotherapy. She was so weak now she could barely lift her head. "Tell me about the house again," she whispered, her voice thin and raspy. James took her small hand, careful of the IV lines. "It's right by the park with a big bay window in what will be your room. You can see the sunrise every morning, and there's a garden where we can plant flowers, any kind you want. Can we plant yellow roses? Mom loved yellow roses. We'll plant hundreds of them," James promised, fighting back tears. He had already bought the house, had decorators working around the clock to create Sophie's dream bedroom, but her doctors weren't sure she'd ever get to see it. Dr. Chen entered the room, her face serious. "Mr. Whitmore, can we talk outside?" James squeezed Sophie's hand. "I'll be right back, Princess. Try to rest." In the hallway, Dr. Chen didn't waste time. "The cancer is spreading faster than we can fight it. Without a bone marrow transplant soon, I'm afraid." "How soon?" James demanded. "Weeks, maybe less. We've tested everyone in the registry, but without a family member." James slammed his fist against the wall, making a nurse jump. "Where is that bastard? His daughter is dying and he won't even get tested." "Actually," a familiar voice said, "that's why I'm here." They turned to see Mrs. Thompson from Social Services, and beside her stood a woman in her 50s with graying hair and Sophie's same gentle eyes. "This is Margaret Collins," Mrs. Thompson said, "Sophie's maternal grandmother." James stared at the woman. "But Sophie said she didn't have any other family." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Robert, Sophie's father, he cut all ties after Maria died. Wouldn't let me see Sophie. I've been searching for them for 2 years. Then I saw the news." Dr. Chen stepped forward, urgently. "Would you be willing to be tested? As a blood relative?" "I'll do anything," Margaret said firmly. "That's my granddaughter in there." James felt hope for the first time in weeks. But then he saw Linda hurrying down the hall, her face pale. "James, you need to see this right now." She held up her tablet, showing a live news conference. Robert Martinez stood at a podium, tears streaming down his face. "My daughter is dying," he was saying, "and this rich man is keeping her from her real family. He's trying to buy her like he buys everything else. But Sophie needs her father now. She needs her family's love, not some stranger's money." James felt sick. The performance was perfect. A grieving father fighting for his child against a ruthless billionaire. "He's filing for immediate emergency custody," Linda said quietly. "The hearing is tomorrow." Margaret grabbed James's arm. "Don't let him take her. You don't know what he did to my Maria, how he treated them both." "Mr. Whitmore?" a small voice called from Sophie's room. "James?" They all hurried back in. Sophie was trying to sit up, her face pale and frightened. "I heard voices. What's wrong?" James sat on the edge of her bed, but before he could speak, Sophie saw Margaret and her eyes went wide. "Grandma." Margaret moved forward slowly, tears flowing freely now. "My sweet girl, my precious girl." Sophie looked at James, confused and scared. "What's happening? Why is everyone here?" James took a deep breath. "Sophie, your grandmother is here to help you get better. She's going to get tested to see if she can give you some of her healthy blood cells. Like a transplant. Exactly like that. But sweetheart, there's something else we need to talk about. Your father—" "No." Sophie tried to sit up straighter, setting off a coughing fit. James quickly helped her with her oxygen mask while Margaret watched, her heart breaking. When Sophie could breathe again, she gripped James's hand with surprising strength. "Don't let him take me away, please. He doesn't really want me. He just wants to hurt you." "Nobody's taking you anywhere," James said firmly. "I promised to protect you, remember?" But later that night, after Sophie had finally fallen asleep, James's lawyers painted a grim picture. "The press coverage is brutal," the head lawyer said. Martinez's team is playing the sympathy card perfectly, and now with the grandmother showing up, it complicates things. Complicates things, James hissed, trying to keep his voice down. She could save Sophie's life? Yes, but it also proves there's viable family. The courts generally favor blood relatives, especially when the alternative is, well, a cold-hearted billionaire who must have ulterior motives, James finished. Bitterly, the lawyer looked uncomfortable. The hearing tomorrow, it's not going to be easy. James walked to Sophie's bedside, watching her sleep. She was so small, so fragile. The thought of her being taken away, being subjected to her father's neglect again. What are my options? Legally, not many. But off the record, you have a private jet and enough money to— Stop. James held up his hand. I won't do that to her. She needs the treatment here. Her life depends on it. Suddenly, Sophie stirred, her face contorting in pain. James was there instantly, holding her hand, as another wave of nausea hit. As he helped her through it, wiping her face with a cool cloth, murmuring soft words of comfort, he knew what he had to do. After Sophie had settled back to sleep, James made a call. Get me Robert Martinez, not his lawyers. Him. Tell him. Tell him I want to make a deal. An hour later, James stood on the hospital roof, the cold wind whipping at his suit. Robert Martinez swaggered toward him, looking nothing like a concerned father. Finally ready to talk business, Whitmore. James looked at the man who had abandoned his dying child, who was now using her suffering for profit, and felt nothing but cold fury. Name your price. Martinez smiled, ugly and triumphant. Now we're speaking my language. Down in room 412, Sophie slept on, unaware that her fate was being decided in a midnight deal on the hospital roof. But as the two men faced each other under the dark sky, neither of them knew that destiny had one more card to play, one that would change everything. To the Kai. Morning papers were filled with shocking headlines. Whitmore Industries CEO steps down. Billionaire gives up empire. James Whitmore transfers majority control to save sick child. The business world was in chaos. But in Sophie's hospital room, there was only quiet. You gave it all away? Linda asked in disbelief, watching James read to a sleeping Sophie. Everything you spent your life building? James didn't look up from the book. Not everything. I kept enough to ensure Sophie will always be taken care of. The rest, Martinez can have it, as long as he signed away his parental rights. But your company, your legacy. This is my legacy now, James said softly, touching Sophie's hand. Everything else was just stuff. The door opened and Dr. Chen rushed in, her face flushed with excitement. The test results are back. Margaret is a match, a perfect match. James felt his heart leap. So we can do the transplant. We need to start right away, Sophie's latest blood work. Dr. Chen's expression darkened. We don't have much time. As if sensing they were talking about her, Sophie stirred. James? She called weakly. I'm right here, Princess. He took her hand. And I have wonderful news. Your grandmother is going to help make you better. Sophie's tired eyes moved to Dr. Chen. Is it going to hurt? A little, the doctor admitted. But you're the bravest patient I have, remember? Margaret appeared in the doorway, already in a hospital gown. Her eyes were determined. I'm ready whenever you are. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Sophie was moved to a special isolation room for the transplant. James had to put on a sterile gown, mask, and gloves just to sit with her, but nothing could have kept him away. I heard what you did, Sophie whispered, as they waited for the procedure to begin. About giving away your company? James smoothed her hair back from her forehead. You heard about that, huh? Why did you do it? Because some things are worth more than all the money in the world. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. But you worked so hard for it. Dad said on TV that it was your whole life. He was right. It was my whole life. But then this amazing little girl came along and showed me that I wasn't really living at all. I was just collecting things. The transplant process began. Margaret's healthy stem cells were carefully extracted and prepared, while Sophie received one final round of intense chemotherapy to prepare her body. James stayed by her side through the worst of it, holding her hand through the pain and nausea. Tell me about the garden again, Sophie asked between bouts of sickness. The one at our house. So James painted pictures with his words, describing the yellow roses they would plant, the little pond they would build, the bench where they could sit and read together. He talked until his voice was hoarse, trying to give her something to hold on to through the pain. Finally, it was time. The healthy stem cells were ready to be transplanted. Dr. Chen hung the bag of life-giving cells while James and Margaret watched, holding hands like old friends united in their love for Sophie. Now we wait, Dr. Chen said. The next few days will be critical. Those days were the longest of James's life. Sophie's body fought fever after fever as it tried to accept the new cells. There were moments when the machines would start beeping alarmingly and nurses would rush in. James never left her side, not even to sleep. Margaret brought him coffee and sandwiches which he barely touched. They took turns talking to Sophie, telling her stories, reminding her she had so much to live for. You know, Margaret said one night as they watched Sophie sleep, Maria would have loved you. The way you love Sophie. It's what she always wanted for her daughter. James looked at the older woman. Tell me about Maria. Sophie talks about her all the time, but I want to know more. So Margaret shared stories about her daughter, how she had been a kindergarten teacher, how she would sing while she cooked, how she had faced her own illness with such grace and courage. Sophie is so much like her, Margaret said, wiping away tears. That same spirit, that same capacity for love. On the fourth night after the transplant, Sophie's fever finally broke. Her blood tests began showing promising signs. The new cells were taking hold. It's working, Dr. Chen announced, her professional demeanor cracking into a wide smile. She's actually doing it. James sank into his chair, overwhelmed with relief. Margaret burst into tears of joy. But the best moment came when Sophie opened her eyes, really opened them for the first time in days. James, she called. Grandma. They were both at her side instantly. How do you feel, sweetheart? James asked. Sophie thought for a moment. Hungry, she said. Can I have pancakes? James and Margaret laughed through their tears. Dr. Chen quickly approved a light breakfast, and James sent Linda to get fresh pancakes from Sophie's favorite diner. As Sophie ate her first real meal in days, sitting up in bed with more strength than she'd shown in weeks, James watched in wonder. The color was returning to her cheeks. Her eyes were brighter. You know what this means? He said, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. Once you're stronger, we can go home, to our house, to our garden. Sophie's face lit up. Really? You promise? I promise. And you know what else? Your grandmother is going to live in the guest house right there in the garden, so she'll always be close. Sophie looked from James to Margaret and back again, her eyes filling with happy tears. Like a real family? Margaret took her hand. We are a real family, sweetheart. Not the usual kind, maybe, but real all the same. James watched them together, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. He had lost his company. His fortune was a fraction of what it had been, and the business world thought he had lost his mind. But sitting there, watching Sophie eat pancakes and talk excitedly about the garden they would plant together, James Whitmore knew he had never been richer in his life. Outside the hospital, reporters were still trying to understand why a ruthless billionaire had given up everything for a sick child he barely knew. But inside room 412, there was no mystery there was just love. And sometimes that's the only explanation needed. The front door of the Victorian house opened slowly as James carried Sophie across the threshold. After 3 months in the hospital, they were finally home. The morning sun streamed through the bay windows, illuminating the grand staircase decorated with welcome home balloons and banners. Is this really ours? Sophie whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the high ceilings and warm wooden floors. All ours, James said, his voice thick with emotion. Want to see your room? Sophie nodded eagerly, and James carried her upstairs. He had spent weeks working with designers to create the perfect space, but he'd insisted on painting the walls himself. The soft yellow color reminded him of Sophie's favorite roses. When he opened the door, Sophie gasped. The room was a little girl's dream come true. A canopy bed sat beneath the bay window, just as he had promised. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with all her favorite stories. A hand-painted mural of a garden covered another wall, complete with butterflies and tiny twinkling lights. "Look out the window," James urged. Sophie looked out at the backyard, where construction workers were finishing the garden. The greenhouse was already complete, and dozens of rose bushes waited to be planted. "And see that pretty little house back there?" James pointed to the newly built guest house. "That's where Grandma's going to live." "When can we plant the roses?" Sophie asked, her face pressed against the glass. "As soon as you're strong enough. But remember what Dr. Chen said, we have to be patient." Sophie's recovery was going well, but she still had a long way to go. She needed weekly checkups, and her immune system was fragile, but her spirit was stronger than ever. Margaret arrived that afternoon with boxes of old photo albums. "I thought you might like to see these," she said, sitting on Sophie's bed. "They're pictures of your mom when she was your age." Sophie eagerly opened an album, and James watched as grandmother and granddaughter laughed over photos of Maria as a little girl. In one picture, she was planting flowers with her own mother. "She loved gardens too," Margaret said softly. "Just like you." Later that evening, as James was preparing dinner, he'd been taking cooking classes, determined to learn. Linda arrived with some papers that needed his attention. "The board is still fighting the transfer," she said quietly, so Sophie wouldn't hear from the living room where she was watching TV with Margaret. "They're claiming you weren't mentally competent when you made the deal." James stirred the pasta sauce he was making, Sophie's favorite. "Let them fight, I knew they would, but the contracts are solid. Robert Martinez is giving interviews again," Linda continued reluctantly. "He's saying you bribed him, that you forced him to give up his rights." The wooden spoon in James's hand snapped. "That lying—" "James," Sophie called from the living room. "Can you come here?" He took a deep breath, set down the broken spoon, and went to her. She was looking at a news program on TV where her father was indeed being interviewed. "He's crying again," Sophie said, her voice small. "Why does he keep doing this?" James sat beside her, pulling her close. "Sometimes people cry because they're sad, and sometimes they cry because they want other people to feel sorry for them. I used to cry because I missed him," Sophie admitted. "But now, is it bad that I don't miss him anymore?" Margaret took her other hand. "No, sweetheart, it's not bad at all. Sometimes the family we choose is more real than the family we're born with." A timer dinged in the kitchen, and James got up to check on dinner. When he returned with plates of spaghetti, Sophie was showing Margaret the garden plans she'd drawn. "And here's where we'll put a bird bath," she was saying excitedly. "James says we can get one with a little fountain." As they ate dinner together, James marveled at how natural it felt. This was what he'd been missing all those years in his penthouse apartment, all those lonely meals in expensive restaurants. After dinner, as they sat in the living room, Sophie suddenly asked, "Can I call you Dad?" James froze, his heart pounding. "What?" "I mean, only if you want me to," Sophie said quickly, looking nervous. "It's just, you're more like a real dad than he ever was. But if it's weird—" James pulled her into a tight hug, tears streaming down his face. "I would be honored, Sophie, more than honored." Margaret wiped her own eyes, smiling at the scene, but their peaceful moment was interrupted by James's phone buzzing. It was his lawyer. "Turn on Channel 7, the lawyer said urgently. James grabbed the remote and his heart sank. Robert Martinez was holding another press conference, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a woman James recognized instantly, his ex-wife Catherine. "James Whitmore abandoned our children," Catherine was saying tearfully. "He walked away from his own flesh and blood, and now he's trying to buy himself a replacement family." Sophie looked at James in confusion. "You have other children?" James felt the world tilting beneath him. He had never told Sophie about his past, about the family he'd lost in his blind pursuit of wealth and power. I did. I do. A son and a daughter." His voice cracked. "I haven't seen them in 15 years. "Where are they?" Sophie asked. "I don't know," James admitted, the shame washing over him. "After the divorce, I threw myself into work. I missed birthdays, holidays. Eventually, they stopped trying to reach me." Margaret stood up, I think I'll make some hot chocolate. This feels like a hot chocolate kind of conversation. When she left, Sophie climbed into James's lap, just like she did when she was scared at the hospital. Are you sad about them? Every day, James whispered. I didn't know how to fix it, how to make up for all the hurt I caused. Maybe you could try, Sophie suggested, like how you tried with me? James looked at this incredible child who had taught him so much about love and redemption. You think I should? Mom always said it's never too late to say sorry, Sophie said wisely. And you're really good at fixing things now. Margaret returned with hot chocolate topped with marshmallows, and they sat together in the warm living room, talking about second chances and healing old wounds. Later that night, after Sophie was asleep in her new bed, James stood in his study, looking at an old photo he kept hidden in his desk. Two children smiled at the camera, a boy of 12 and a girl of 10. His children, Michael and Emma. He picked up his phone and, for the first time in 15 years, dialed his ex-wife's number. Catherine, he said when she answered, we need to talk, not for the cameras, for real, because Sophie was right. It was never too late to try to fix things. And if a little girl could, teach a hardened billionaire how to love again, maybe she could help heal other broken hearts too. Outside, the garden waited for its roses. Inside, a new kind of family was blooming. One built not on blood or obligation, but on choice and love. And second chances. The garden was coming alive with color. Sophie sat in her wheelchair, directing James and Margaret as they planted the last of the yellow roses. She was getting stronger every day, but still tired easily. Her hair was starting to grow back, soft and fuzzy like a baby bird. A little. To the left, she called out, taking her role as garden supervisor very seriously. The sunshine will be better there. James wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of dirt. He'd never done physical labor like this in his life, but he loved every minute of it. Every rose they planted was another promise kept, another step toward their future. James? Sophie's voice turned serious. When are Michael and Emma coming? His hands stilled in the dirt. After weeks of careful negotiations through Catherine, his children had agreed to visit. They were coming today. Soon, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Are you sure you're feeling up to this? Sophie nodded firmly. They're family too, and Mum always said family should try to fix things. Margaret smiled at her granddaughter's wisdom. Maria was right about that. Why don't we get you cleaned up before they arrive? As Margaret wheeled Sophie inside, James stayed in the garden, his thoughts in turmoil. He hadn't seen his children in 15 years. Michael was now 27, Emma 25. They were strangers to him. The doorbell rang an hour later. James opened it with trembling hands. They stood on his porch, his children, now adults. Michael was tall, with James's grey eyes and serious expression. Emma looked so much like her mother it made his heart ache. Hello, Father, Michael said formally. James felt the weight of that formal address like a physical pain. Thank you for coming. Please come in. They followed him to the living room, where Sophie sat waiting in her favorite armchair. She had insisted on wearing her prettiest dress for the occasion. Hi, she said brightly. I'm Sophie. I've been really excited to meet you. Emma and Michael exchanged glances, clearly thrown by this cheerful child. They had expected many things, but not this. So you're our sister? Emma asked hesitantly. Not by blood, Sophie explained. But James, I mean Dad, says family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about love instead. Michael's head snapped up. Dad? He said sharply. James stepped forward. Yes, she calls me Dad because I'm trying to be one, finally. I know it's too late for... Too late? Michael cut him off. It was too late when you missed my high school graduation. Too late when you didn't come to Emma's wedding. Too late when Mom got sick and you didn't even call. Michael, Emma touched her brother's arm. We agreed to listen. Listen to what? Michael demanded. How he abandoned us for his precious company, and now he's playing happy families with some kid he barely knows. Sophie's voice cut through the tension. He gave it all away. Everyone turned to look at her. The company, Sophie continued. He gave it away to save me. And now he's learning to plant roses and cook spaghetti and read bedtime stories. He's not very good at the cooking part yet, but he tries really hard. Emma sat down suddenly, her eyes filling with tears. You gave up your company? You? James nodded. It turns out some things are more important than money and power. I learned that lesson too late for you both, and I'm so sorry. More sorry than you can ever know. Michael paced the room, agitated. Do you know what it was like? Watching you on TV, reading about your business success, knowing you had time for everything except us? I do know, James said quietly, because I see it now in every father who comes to the hospital where Sophie was treated. Men in expensive suits who can't spare 5 minutes for their sick children. I was that man. I was worse than that, man, and I will regret it every day of my life. Margaret appeared with a tray of lemonade and cookies. Sophie's recipe, she said, setting it down. She's been practicing for today. Emma took a cookie, biting into it carefully. Her eyes widened. These are Mum's cookies, her special recipe. Sophie beamed. Grandma Margaret had your mum's old cookbook. She's been teaching me lots of recipes. Want to see our kitchen? We painted it yellow because that's the happiest color. Without waiting for an answer, Sophie started wheeling herself toward the kitchen. After a moment's hesitation, Emma followed her. Michael stayed behind, staring at his father. Why her? He asked finally. What made you change for her when you couldn't change for us? James sank into a chair. I didn't change for her, I changed because of her. She showed me what I'd become, what I'd lost. She gave back my briefcase full of money without a thought when she was sick and homeless and needed every penny. And all she asked for in return was dinner. Not money, not presents, just time. The one thing you never gave us, Michael said bitterly. Yes, James admitted. And I know I can never get that time back. I know I can never truly make up for what I did to you and Emma. But I can try to be better now. I can try to be the father you deserved back then. From the kitchen, they heard Sophie and Emma laughing. They went to look and found them covered in flour, apparently attempting to make more cookies. Sorry, Sophie giggled. I'm still learning. Want to help, Michael? There's plenty of flour left to spill. Michael looked at this small, brave child who had somehow cracked open his father's frozen heart. She smiled at him, holding out a flour-covered hand, and suddenly he saw what his father had seen. Pure, unconditional love, asking nothing in return. Yeah, he said softly, I'd like that. They spent the afternoon baking cookies that turned out slightly burnt but made with love. Sophie told them stories about their father learning to be a dad, his failed attempts at cooking, his determination to paint her room himself, his nightly ritual of reading stories complete with funny voices. As the day went on, the tension slowly eased. Emma helped Sophie plant a special rose bush in memory of both their mothers. Michael found himself laughing at Sophie's impression of James trying to operate the washing machine for the first time. When it was time for them to leave, Sophie hugged them both fiercely. Will you come back? She asked. I'm getting better, every day, and soon I'll be strong enough to play in the garden. We could all play together. Emma knelt beside her wheelchair. I'd like that. And maybe next time I could bring your niece. She's 2 and she loves gardens. Sophie's eyes lit up. I have a niece? Her name is Maria, Emma said softly, not missing how James's eyes filled with tears at the name. Michael cleared his throat. I have a son too. He's 4. James, after Grandpa. James stared at his son, overwhelmed. He had grandchildren he'd never met. Come for dinner next week, he said hoarsely. All of you. Please. Emma and Michael exchanged looks. Then Emma nodded. We'll come. But Dad? Yes? We're coming for Sophie, she said firmly. The rest, that will take time. James nodded, understanding. Time is all I'm asking for. That, and a chance to try again. As they watched Emma and Michael drive away, Sophie took James's hand. See? Sometimes broken things can be fixed. James looked down at this wise little girl who had changed his life in so many ways. Yes, they can. One day at a time, one heart at a time. The sun was setting over their garden, painting the yellow roses gold. In the guest house, Margaret was baking a fresh batch of cookies. And in James's heart, hope bloomed like a garden in spring, because Sophie was right. It was never too late for love to heal what was broken. 1 year had passed since the day Sophie returned James's briefcase. The garden was in full bloom, yellow roses climbing the trellises, their sweet scent filling the air. Sophie ran through. The grass, her strength fully returned, her dark hair now falling past her shoulders in curls just like her mother's. "Careful with your cousin," James called out as Sophie played tag with little Maria, Emma's daughter. On the patio, Emma watched them while feeding her new baby boy, whom she had named James, after the father she was slowly learning to trust again. Michael sat with his son Jamie on the garden swing that James had built, teaching him how to make paper airplanes. Margaret was in her element, bringing out lemonade and cookies for everyone, her guest house now the heart of family gatherings. "Dr. Chen is here," Sophie announced excitedly as a car pulled into the driveway. The doctor who had saved Sophie's life had become part of their extended family, joining them for their Sunday gatherings whenever she could. Today was special, though. It was Sophie's 1-year checkup and everyone had gathered to hear the results. "Well?" James asked anxiously as Dr. Chen joined them in the garden. She smiled broadly. Still completely cancer-free, the transplant was a complete success. The garden erupted in cheers. Sophie hugged Dr. Chen, then ran to James, throwing herself into his arms. "Does this mean I can start school next month?" "Yes, princess," James said, holding her tight. "You can start 4th grade just like we planned." Linda, who had stayed on as James's assistant even after he gave up his company, appeared with champagne for the adults and sparkling cider for the children. "A toast," she proposed, "to Sophie, the girl who changed everything." As glasses clinked, Robert Martinez's face appeared on the TV that Michael had been watching between paper airplane lessons. He was being led away in handcuffs. The former father of Sophie Martinez Whitmore was arrested today on charges of fraud and extortion, the news anchor reported. Sources say Martinez attempted to blackmail several prominent business figures using his daughter's story. James quickly turned off the TV, but Sophie had already seen it. She climbed into his lap like she used to do in the hospital. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Sophie nodded. "He's not my father anymore. He never really was. You're my dad, the one who reads me stories and burns the pancakes and learns to plant roses even though you're allergic." Emma came over, carrying baby James. "Here, Sophie, want to hold your baby brother?" Sophie's eyes lit up as Emma carefully placed the infant in her arms. "He's so tiny. Was I ever this tiny?" "Teeny, Margaret said, taking pictures, "but just as precious." Michael joined them, carrying Jamie on his shoulders. "Hey, Dad, Jamie wants to know if you'll teach him about business someday like you used to teach me." James looked at his grown son in surprise. They were still healing, still finding their way back to each other, but moments like this gave him hope. "I could," he said carefully, "but I think I'd rather teach him what Sophie taught me, that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or sold." "Like family?" Jamie asked from his perch on his father's shoulders. "Exactly like family," James agreed. As the afternoon went on, more people arrived. Linda's family, Dr. Chen's husband, even Mrs. Thompson from social services, who had become a dear friend. The garden that Sophie had dreamed of during those dark hospital days had become a gathering place, a healing place. Later, as the sun began to set, Sophie took James's hand and led him to a special corner of the garden. There, surrounded by the brightest yellow roses, stood a small bronze plaque. "In memory of Maria Martinez," it read, "who taught her daughter that kindness is like cookies. It can make anyone's day better." Sophie knelt by the plaque, placing a fresh cookie beside it. It was a tradition she had started, leaving one of her grandmother's cookies for her mother every Sunday. "Do you think she'd be proud of us?" Sophie asked. "Of our family." James knelt beside her, his expensive suit getting grass stains that he no longer cared about. "I know she would be. You've created something amazing, Sophie. You've brought healing to so many hearts." "We did it together," Sophie corrected him. "Like the roses. You have to plant them together, water them together, and then wait together for them to bloom." From the patio came the sounds of laughter. As Michael and Emma's children played, while Margaret told stories about their grandmother Maria, and Dr. Chen discussed Sophie's latest test results with Mrs. Thompson. It was the sound of family, messy, complicated, beautiful family. "You know." "What, Princess?" James said, pulling Sophie close. "A year ago I thought I was the one saving you, but the truth is you saved me. You saved all of us." Sophie smiled, that same bright smile that had first warmed his frozen heart in a hospital room so long ago. "That's what family does," she said simply. "We save each other." The evening light turned the yellow roses to gold, and a warm breeze carried the scent of Margaret's fresh-baked cookies across the garden. James looked around at the family he had lost and found again, at the new family he had built, at the second chances that had bloomed like roses in what he had thought was the winter of his life. And there in the garden, with Sophie's hand in his, James Whitmore, former billionaire, recovered father and forever changed man, finally understood what true wealth meant. It wasn't in the empire he had built and lost. It wasn't in the deals he had won or the power he had wielded. It was in a little girl's trust, in a son's forgiveness, in a daughter's tentative smile, in a grandmother's wisdom. In a garden full of yellow roses and healing hearts, it was in love, the kind that asks for nothing but time, that gives without counting the cost, that changes lives with the simple return of a briefcase and a request for dinner. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sophie leaned against him and whispered, "I love you, Dad." And James Whitmore, holding his daughter close, knew that he had never been richer in his life. The end.